my extreme honor to be sitting on this panel, because this panel represents kind of the best of what you can think about doing with war games, the role that war games play in policy, and then how war games can help us understand both contemporary and historical problems. So you guys have their bios in front of you, but I want to do a tiny introduction because I'm such a fan of all of these folks. So John Emery came to us all the way from Oklahoma, which I appreciate. But John has published some of the best work looking at wargaming material and understanding how ethics influence nuclear policy planning. So if you're interested, his piece is actually printed out and out in the front. And sitting next to him is Stacy Pettyjohn, who, remember all the times in the briefing where I showed how important war games have become? Like, they're all being run by you. So Stacy came from RAND and then has been at CNAS for
over 2 years now.
Only 2. Wow, it feels like longer. Where you have not just been running war games, you actually run an entire defense program. But most recently, your work on U.S.-Taiwan, including your partnership with Congressman Gallagher, has gotten a lot of attention and probably had a very significant influence on U.S. foreign policy choices. And then finally, Matt Turpin. So Matt has the NSC experience on the panel, but also served before the NSC, so has experienced wargaming both as a policymaker and as probably within the services. And his other hat is he's now working for a big tech data issue kind of company. Maybe you guys have heard of it. It's called Palantir. I don't know, small startup. So excited to have all these perspectives on the panel. Matt, I'm going to go ahead and just start with you. So when you were in the NSC, were there war games that you came across that were highly influential? How did you think about integrating war games into the kind of planning process?
Well, thanks so much, Jackie. And I was just reminiscing with my fellow panelists that, yeah, I just hearken back to sort of not only my NSC days, but my days in the Pentagon and out at Pacific Command, and that my experiences in participating in war games have been instrumental in coloring the way in which I thought about the problems we faced, about how decision-making would work. Whether it was with the team sitting down in the basement of the Pentagon and in J8, or some things that we would run in the EAOB, but a variety of different methods really used to drive sort of like how are humans going to react to these different sort of scenarios, right? And I found that to be incredibly important. My background as a historian is I sort of think through how decision making happens at sort of the policy level. The ability to get sort of practice and repetitions of sort of putting yourself through a scenario, and then working with your community of sort of the people that you work with to see how they respond. And be able to make decisions is just absolutely invaluable, right? Now, it probably doesn't provide sort of completely repeatable and those sorts of things, and probably you're deeply colored by your own experience in them. It's more emotional than necessarily analytic, and so I just can't. I can't say enough, and much of this comes from my experience in working for Deputy Secretary of Work as he began a whole revitalization of a wargaming effort sort of back in 2014, 2015, as we thought about, how do we deal with the kinds of challenges that we could see on the horizon with Beijing, and that we needed to reinvigorate our own processes to be able to figure that out.
I think this is exactly the repository that you're talking about, right? Which has had we probably would have to talk offline, but it has some challenges as it's been built. But the idea that Bob Work had to be able to aggregate information and look across war games, part of kind of why I'm here talking about this today, because he had such a big influence. Well, moving from, policy and classified games, You worked in both classified and unclassified games, Stacey, and like most recently, unclassified games in think tanks that are not necessarily, CNES is not an FFRDC, and it does not have a direct link to the services. So what is the role of think tanks in playing both classified, kind of with your old RAND hat on, and unclassified games?
Thanks, Jackie. It's a pleasure to be here and to be on this panel. And it's great to see so many familiar faces and so many talented and experienced wargamers in the crowd as well. So I think think tanks play a really important role being an outside voice, whether it is an FFRDC or institution like mine right now that runs unclassified war games, because we can step outside of the box that the Pentagon lives in and actually challenge a lot of the assumptions, which can drive many of the outcomes. And certainly, even with classified war games at RAND and other FFRDCs, that is part of what they do. They can be they're not unbiased, but differently biased sort of adjudicator and one who designs the games and reports on them instead of one of the entities within the Pentagon that might have more equities at stake with any particular issue that's going on. There's, I think, tremendous value and need for having classified war games. You need to look at a lot of these issues in detail and make sure that the specifics are right. But war games are pretty coarse tools. They're not going to give you precise answers. They're not going to actually give you an answer. They're going to best give you some insights. And I think this is why oftentimes unclassified games are undervalued and can be just as useful if you're looking to really stress test different plans, to think through potential problems, and to just explore a decision space that you don't understand very well.
I think, so your experience is both at RAND and CNES. You've actually had an intimate look at some of the RAND games. I'm interested how the games that you looked at revealed something about RAND to you.
Yes. I think we all have, especially the early RAND days of the 1950s, we have a very caricatured view of RAND, right? As the Wizards of Armageddon or the thermonuclear Jesuits, that kind of popularized view. Or you kind of swing to the other side of the spectrum where you think that these were the ultimate game theoreticians that were, playing games that would decide the fate of the world, right? And I think both assumptions were a little bit wrong. But I thought I was going to go in there I actually didn't even want to study ethics or war games per se. I wanted to look at how did they think about a new military technology, nuclear weapons, and how did they think through the dilemmas of that? And the way they did that in the early 1950s was by creating war games. One in particular called the Cold War game, where they were trying to integrate politics and economics into kind of traditional military gaming. So seeing the relation between politics, the economy, and military in the nuclear era. And so the interesting thing about RAND is that something that I didn't know until I got into there is that they had a social sciences division. And they also had the kind of more famous mathematics and economics division, right? And so they developed competing war games with each other to best synthesize the dilemmas of nuclear war. So you have this kind of really fascinating early empirical test of the epistemological debate that we still have today. And you get to see how they both played out in different outcomes. But where I think I'm most interested in these war games is that the assumptions that go into it, how these assumptions and how taking uncertainty seriously can drive outcomes. So I think this kind of early empirical test and this historical look really gives us some important lessons, because they were asking a lot of the same questions in 54 that we're asking today about the utility of war games.
So for all three of you, and kind of from different perspectives, people that run games, play games, have looked at gaming data, what role do emotions play?
Huge role. I think Matt's absolutely correct. The impact that games often have is the deepest on their players, and it's often because it is an emotional response. You can go back to, I heard the stories when I started gaming at RAND from some of the more experienced researchers about a war game that the Air Force ran in 2008 with RAND and CSBA called Pacific Vision 2008. And that was the first time that RAND, despite almost a decade of research and rigorous, long reports, tons of analytic briefings, had gotten the Pacific Air Forces to take seriously the airbase vulnerability problem and the fact that if you pile hundreds of aircraft on Kadena Air Base on Okinawa, that they will likely be blown up. And it was because the then commander, General Chandler, had participated in the game and had a visceral emotional reaction to it. So as sometimes a communications tool, I think the emotions are an important part and power of the games.
Yeah, I mean, and simply placing yourself into the, you depending upon the role you're playing in a game, to put yourself in the sort of the shoes or the seat of having to make consequential decisions, and then to see that there are both positive and negative outcomes that come from those decisions, and that in many ways there are not sort of, there is no sort of winning move that you can make, right? Every one of them comes with a consequence, and you're going to have to deal with those consequences, and you're going to have to continue to sort of move through the scenario. And then it makes you sort of appreciate the, what should I have been doing beforehand? In many ways, what are the, there is sort of the going in conditions of the game, and then putting yourself in the position of, these are the things that I would have wanted to have had in place beforehand before this thing went off, right? Those are the kinds of lessons, I think, Representative Thornberry was sort of making this point as he sort of went through his point is that for many times for political leaders and for senior leaders, the ability to be able to sort of draw conclusions about the kinds of sort of starting points that you'd want to be at, right? The logistics for Admiral Ruffhead, as he was talking about, to me, that is just so pressing. And what it does is it encourages you to go sort of back to your day job and sort of redouble the efforts to make sure that of the lessons that you sort of learned from this, that you are taking actions to make sure that those things that you saw as the biggest problems at least deserve more attention and thinking through than what you had before, that you may have dismissed because you were sort of busy in the day-to-day process and not thinking about the kind of scenarios you might be in the future.
And I think for me, emotion is absolutely central. I think we still have this false dichotomy between reason and emotion. And emotion is central for decision making, for analysis, for strategy, but especially for ethical decision making, right? Ethics is always reasoned through emotion, so to speak. So what I found in the social scientist Cold War game in 1954 was that one of the main conclusions in this kind of very free play game, where the point wasn't to get from one move to another, but to think through implications and think differently, to gain understanding. The role of emotion was central in that the conclusion was those that advocated bold, imaginative policies in their papers and things like that found themselves acting with extreme caution when they faced the burden of policymaking. Right? It's very different when you write down, possible 100,000 casualties in your paper than when you are the one, even in a game simulated environment, having to make that decision. Right? And I make the argument that leads to a kind of ethical restraint, that facing the consequences of your action, understanding that burden, is something that war games can be very useful in. Right? And so I think that emotion kind of comes central to that, and that's something that simulations and war games can kind of bring to the fore, is that kind of ethical intuition, as I like to call it.
So I didn't prep this question for you, so I'm sorry, but I follows very closely to this conversation. Both Matt and John have talked about consequences. As a game designer, you have some role in figuring out how your players create that sense of consequences. So what have you found that works the best? Do players internalize the consequences of their games, and how much of game design is involved, or is it just substantive or like on the person?
No, game design is integral to creating those consequences and making sure you provide the feedback that the players need to understand what the implications of their decisions are and what the interaction between different teams' decisions have been. This is also one of the thorniest areas because it is where you end up putting your finger on the scale in terms of determining the consequences, even if they're well researched, even if it's based on a quantitative model or qualitative model. You know, you are determining whether something succeeds or loses, which is why it is really important often for games that are being used for analysis that you actually have done research on what might drive the outcomes. And in some other games where you're really exploring the situation and trying to understand how the different sides react to each other, it's incumbent upon the teams to actually provide those consequences because they respond and then decide how they are going to act as a result.
Yeah, you're not responding because you're worried about the consequences to your boss necessarily, right? Like your individual consequences. You have put yourself in the position of the decision maker and you have internalized those consequences.
Right, and internalized that that there is actually, you are making moral decisions, you are making ethical decisions, even though it's in a game. And I think that means that there's a high degree of trust that then goes to those game designers, that they're actually doing so within the construct of the interests of the organization or the broader sort of mission you're trying to achieve, right? That participants allow themselves to become emotionally invested in the decision making, which makes it more realistic, with the full trust that the way in which the game is designed is to bring about useful things for the organization, for the country, right, and those sorts of things. And I think that in many ways that trust wouldn't exist if there isn't that degree of sort of trust from both sides, that each one is participating in good faith, right? So I mean, it wouldn't work if you didn't view the game designer and the other players as participating in good faith.
So I think that as game designers, sometimes what you just said trust, but I think what we say is we don't want players that fight the game. Okay, and you need to design it in a way where they're not fighting the game and they're actually immersed into the game. And sometimes that's, on the player, and often, as Stacey pointed out, that's on the game designer to build a game that does not have to be fought. But Stacey, these choices that you had to make are a little bit unique because you come to this as both a social scientist and a practitioner. And there is a bit of a dichotomy between those communities. They're not always they're not always in agreement. So how do you reconcile? Like how do you think about being a war game designer who's both a social scientist and a practitioner?
So I actually found my political science training to be very useful when I started wargaming. Surprise, surprise. I really had thought I'd wasted a lot of time in graduate school. But it was the research design training and the methodological training that was helpful in terms of thinking very consciously about how you design a game and what choices you're making in terms of biasing things in different directions and trying to limit the number of variables that you're changing over time so that you don't have this wild, unconstrained sort of experiment, which is essentially what the RAND researchers did in the 50s. They didn't want to constrain anything, and they created these freeform games. And that is really useful and necessary when you don't have a good understanding of the problem. But once you have some better understanding of the main issues and nail down what your research question is, if you want to learn something, you actually need to put constraints on the game and on what the players do so that you focus their attention on the issues that are most important and that you're trying to have them grapple with, and that you give them consequences and feedback that are relevant to what they did, and help you to test sort of their choices and what evolves over the course of the game. So I think they are intertwined. The two communities do tend to be pretty separate, though there are a number of folks who straddle them, a couple sitting in the room right now. And I think in the policy community, what you find is that there is oftentimes a different purpose than in the academic community. So academics who game are doing so either for causal inference or maybe to teach people. And in the policy community, you're more often trying to learn about something and to actually develop policy options to help you solve the problem. There's also the softer goal that is almost always present, which is bringing different groups of people together to talk about the problem and sort of synthesizing the knowledge that they have that resides in their head and sort of encouraging that collaboration and communication. So that's how I see, the differences between the two. You also, because policy games end up being normally, well, they're not always, fairly large and they're resource intensive, they are not as often run multiple times, and you don't get sort of the large number that political scientists would like to have.
And I think, Stacey's point about sort of the socialization aspect amongst teams of going through the experience of wargaming together, is having people play roles and then sort of play through the scenario and to do that over and over again. That is a team building exercise as well, right? Because there's the emotional aspect to it, but it also sort of, it instills at least a degree of philosophy amongst the players of how each of you thinks about problems and interacts with one another, and the ways in which different roles play through a crisis or a contingency. And I think, again, going back to, I think there is a difference between sort of the trust in the outcome of it and then the sort of the fighting the game. Right? So you're taking for granted that everyone's going to be a little frustrated about decisions that are made in the game, and that's not really realistic, or that wasn't a good constraint. But you really can't have one unless there is sort of this feeling that it's actually being done for a purpose, and that the purpose serves what sort of the organizational purposes are. It couldn't be something that is done that is sort of, has this sort of outside objective that is meant to sort of undermine the interests of the
Well, then that is a fundamental critique then potentially for academic war game.
It could be.
Right?
It could be. And so that level of trust has to be there.
If it feels too much like a lab experiment and not enough like something that has value.
Right.
And I think that's a central tension between realism in the game, like a realistic scenario where you get a lot of buy-in, you can get that emotional engagement, and replicability, right? When you make a lot of simplifying assumptions to make kind of larger N or kind of social scientific causal inference about this, it's probably very different than the kind of Rand freeform games where you're thinking a lot about what may happen in the future and you don't have a lot of good data.
I'm glad you said causal inference.
It's hard. I've done political science training, but it's hard.
Bring it up again because it's actually really hard to do causal inference with what you're working with, because you're looking at free-form data and you're trying to connect data that is not organized in any way that a social scientist would normally organize to get a causal inference. So can you talk a little bit of kind of like how you approach the archive, how you approach wargaming data, whether you treated it differently than other types of data when you were trying to answer this type of question?
So it was especially difficult at Rand with the kind of early history because it's organized by person rather than like this war game. So I basically just found an engineer who became my Virgil of the archives, and he just saved everything he was ever CC'd on. And so I was just kind of digging through, and what was so difficult about this is it took me a long time to figure out, and help of other historians that have worked on some of the individuals at Rand, that there were actually two separate war games. Because they called it the cow, Causes of War, they called it like the bovine quadrupled, all these different things for the fourth round of... So they just keep referencing the cow throughout these things, and it wasn't clear that there were two separate games, that the social scientists basically said, these mathematicians don't know what they're doing, they're getting these really crazy outcomes, when the point of it is to gain understanding. And so they made a spite game in response, and then called it the exact same thing. So kind of discerning all those things is especially difficult, but I think the important lesson from this kind of archival process, and why I'm so grateful to the two of you for kind of getting this a bit more organized and searchable, is that war games can drive kind of whatever outcomes you want them to drive, right? But I think the most fascinating thing about the historical war games is to see the process. What are the assumptions that went into it? What were they assuming about their red team that turned out to perhaps be wrong, right? How are they mirror imaging? So I think going back to the historical record can be really useful because you can have that empirical test to kind of see what were we right about, what were we wrong about, how did that drive game design and outcomes?
So since we're on data, I'm going to ask you to put your Palantir hat on. So what do you see as the future of like data and software and technology and wargaming? We've read quite a few little pieces that are like, wargaming, AI, little light on like the details of what that means. What do you see?
Well, I mean, I think software is going to play an integral role in figuring out, one, how do we take things from a variety of different methods, creating an ontology of what the different of the lexicon of what the different things mean, so that you can do some degree of sort of comparison across these sort of apples and oranges, right? That of course, the ways in which it is done is always going to be sort of different, and how to begin to do this, and that the software could play a role in that. I think, certainly I would see, a role for software really in the tools to be able to arm folks to be able to do things sort of over and over again. Allow machines to be able to do some of the more mundane and time-consuming work, to be able to kind of get out sort of realistic scenarios that you can change certain things and allow an artificial intelligence to be able to do that work, and then to replicate it across all your things so that it actually is realistic for all the players. I mean, obviously, one of the most time-consuming things and sort of human-intensive things is making sure that the entire game is logically consistent all the way through, right? That there aren't sort of glaring errors in the way that looks. That's something that really, software and machine learning could probably help a lot more in. And I don't know if we've actually delved into how that works yet. But to me, it seems to be one of the more promising areas, at least within this field. So maybe I'll stop there and kind of get your
maybe
thoughts.
you guys can solve the BobWork repository issue.
Well, I mean, fundamentally, I think it's going to come down to folks sort of taking it upon themselves, like what you're doing, to be able to do that work, right? I mean, it isn't going to be certainly software can help with that, but it's really going to be people that are experts in the field that actually do that, right? Yeah. It isn't going to be, there isn't some magic AI button that's going to solve that.
I don't know. I feel like I've seen the magic AI button. Right. Well, Stacey, how do you think about integrating technology? Like both how you use technology to run games, but then how you think about simulating emerging technologies in game.
I'm a Luddite. I try to incorporate as little technology as possible because it almost never works. And this is on unclassified systems. So God knows what the chances are on a classified network. But I'm joking, but it's true. Like the scenario video didn't run at the beginning of the game with the House Select Committee. And just had to pull it up from memory at that point. And that happens far too often. I do think, I don't know about AI analyzing the results. I do think there, is potentially promise in being able to sift through a lot of data, and war games can generate tremendous amounts of data if you actually have notes or transcripts, which you don't always have. But you really have to carefully parse the games and go back to, what was built into the orders of battle, the scenarios, the starting assumptions, because a lot of them are very different and incommensurate, and sort of figuring out how you can aggregate or assess them relative to each other is, I think, a fairly painstaking task and something that can very easily be done wrong. I do think there is potential value in the near term in using gaming, which is really focused on humans and how they make decisions and the process that they go through, to see how they respond to AI. So if you had something that, not that they're necessarily interfacing with an algorithm in real time, but it generates COAs and you can see how humans respond if the code doesn't yield the results that they want, or potentially fails or is corrupted. That's an area where it seems potentially ripe for exploration. When you think about new technologies, there are a couple of different ways to approach it in games. Oftentimes, they're just folded into your existing rules. And so, we're going to make the very optimistic assumption that this tech works, and then we're going to see what the implications are.
Yeah.
But the degree to which it works and sort of the scale and the time frame is something that the adjudicators are going to have to decide. And they don't have the type of real world data that often in military adjudication is a lot of the systems that exist is grounded in. So that's a little bit of it. It makes sense. You should do it at times, but it is sort of folding a lot under the curtain. Another way is to try to pull it apart and reveal it. And this is something that I've done at RAND, where we had taken matrix games, which are the argumentation-based games that typically seem to be used for strategic gaming, and I really have not been successful at using them in that way. But at a tactical level, having the players argue and explain why this different technology might have the effect that they want it to, and allowing an opponent to also explain how they would counter it, and then having expert adjudicators weigh in, I think is one way where you can at least sort of pull back the curtain and have some understanding of why you might see certain outcomes.
But I know that your work is like historical, but it says something about emerging technology, because inherently what your case study is how a big organization tried bureaucratically to make certainty or make some sort of understanding of what was, at the time, an emerging technology, nuclear weapons. So what insight did you gain from that?
Yeah, so the mathematicians were very much trying to get the proper variables for economy, for politics, in order to plug them in to treat, as Alexander Muth said in 1954, to treat humans like a black box of a computer. And that modern computers in 1954 would soon solve this problem. Right? So we're having a lot of the same debates, but how organizations think. And I think the big takeaway that the social scientists at RAND gave us were that it's about asking the right questions rather than searching for the answers. And I think that's the big allure of AI today, is that everyone just says the easy AI button, because it gives you this kind of view from nowhere sense of objectivity, when we neglect that it's programmed by humans exercising judgment. And it makes certain assumptions about the world that can fall out when circumstances change. So I think it has huge implications for kind of a reversion to, instead of doing things fast and getting the right answer, it's about asking the right questions and slowing things down sometime, for a bit of muscle memory to exercise practical judgment in intense scenarios.
Well, I'm going to follow up on that with a pressing question for all three of you, which if you guys can answer you get a chapter in my edited volume, which is, what makes a game good?
I think relevancy is a top consideration, right? That it relates to something that as an organization you think is important, and that you don't feel you already know kind of the answers to what you need to do. You feel a degree of as an organization, you feel a degree of unease at the problems that are being posed, right? That there are probably more good questions than there are good answers, and that the game helps to refine those things and is seen as deeply relevant to the challenges you're on, right? And of course, that means that it's a game that is sort of highly specific to the time you're actually in, right? Which is a point that was certainly brought up earlier by folks. To me, that's a truism, and that as you look back historically, you're going to have to put that game within the context of the questions that the organization is facing right then to really gain an understanding of why it made sense.
I mean, it depends on what your game's trying to do, right? So there are different, I think, criteria for games that are intended for different purposes. I I do think that far too often there is a tendency in the policy community to have a sliding scale of objectives and to at least hit the lowest common denominator, which means everybody left feeling good and spoke to each other.
Sponsors happy.
Exactly.
That's always.
More generally for analytic games, I think they need to be held to a higher standard, and there are a range of sort of different characteristics that they need. It doesn't mean that they're not immersive or engaging, because I think player engagement is really important because it is your players and the decisions that they make that are so critical to a game. Needs to have a good research design. You ideally run it more than once. You want players who can make smart decisions, so they have to be qualified on whatever topic that you're talking about. And then really, I think importantly, after the fact, the researchers and the designers of the game have to actually document the game and be very honest about the limitations and the biases that were built into it, so that folks who were not present can understand what substantively they should take from the exercise.
As someone who's never designed a war game, I think I would say that you need to take seriously the role of uncertainty. Right? History is full of examples of things where victories were Pyrrhic, or defeats that ended up being blessings in disguise, and how to put that in a game simulated model or even understanding it for policymaking is a very difficult problem. And I think the other one is to have, at least in my sense, a high degree of realism in games so that you can get that player buy-in to feel that emotion and to feel the weight and burden of policymaking. So when these games migrated from RAND to MIT, one of the students, graduate students that played the game in Lincoln Bluefield's political military games there, a staunch Democrat had to play the role of the United States, and he came out of the game and said, "For the first time in my life, I sympathize with John Foster Dulles." Right? So, which is funny, but he empathized with someone who he vehemently disagreed with in order to understand how difficult it is to make policies. And I think that empathy is kind of key element that wargaming can bring out in us.
So I'm going to ask one last question, then open to the audience, and kind of your parting shot. These games are being used today to influence policy. So what can we do to make either wargaming, the data, or the community? What's the one thing that you would want to be done to make it better?
There's a long list.
I know. You should have saved this for the a lightning round.
I mean, I think there are many things. A lot of them would just be repeating what I just said, but more consciously thinking about game design, not just letting everyone do it, teaching people about gaming beyond sort of like a 101 course, which is one of the few things. Ellie Bartels is in the audience. She wrote her dissertation on gaming and different ways to approach it and think about it and uses. I mean, like there are many, many things that need to be done. But I do think it's worth emphasizing that games have limitations like all types of methods. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily more flawed than other types. And they're, in fact, complementary when they're used in conjunction with them. And they have strengths that no other method can actually bring, because there's no other way to actually have people make decisions. You're otherwise emulating it, and people are not easy to emulate yet, despite GPT getting better with you.
I think, just in a practical sense, having been in the Department of Defense doing it, and then going up to the National Security Council and sort of watching the way in which other departments and agencies thought about decision-making and interfaced. I mean, it's no surprise that wargaming, in many folks' imaginations, primarily resides within the Department of Defense, and that's where it's being done, and that's where it's being thought about. And I think, one of the things that we would need to do is there actually needs to be, efforts by other departments and agencies to develop their own capabilities and their own ways to think about these things and their own methods in which they would do this, right? it was much more apparent to me as I sort of watched this from the outside of the department that for those players that would participate from other departments and agencies, for them, their perspective, what this was, is in many ways sort of cooked to a Department of Defense set of interests and equities. And in fact, that diminishes then the way in which it can be used as a broader effort across the community of the U.S. government and policymaking by making sure that others have their own capability to be able to do this and they have their own methodologies. And then we could actually, I think, start to do things. My fear is, in all too many cases within our sort of economic policy making communities, there is less of a willingness to sort of use these tools to think about scenarios and how they would make decisions and how they would go about things. And that puts us, I think, at a significant disadvantage.
So you think that if we could war game with the Hill about the debt ceiling, we might come to an agreement?
I mean, had we done this 2 or 3 years ago, yeah.
I definitely think, I mean, I'm going to come right back, but one of the things that I'm most interested about the themes of this panel is how much emotions and empathy have come up. Because I think one of the places where we don't use war games enough is using them as a tool of diplomacy and how they can create that empathy and that sense that you're on the same team. And so the focus on war and wargaming and alliances for war instead of kind of how games can actually resolve trust issues between countries. Right. You get the last say on what makes what you can do to make wargaming better or what you'd like.
I think the biggest thing and my biggest fear with a lot of contemporary war game is that single games outcomes that are properly, everyone kind of talks about their limitations, but then they're grabbed in the headlines and saying that this is what will happen in a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, right? And so I think it's just fundamentally misses, and there's not much we can do to control that, but just properly tempering what the outcomes of the game are and what the assumptions are going into it, I think are most helpful. And I think as well, what was interesting in the social scientist game is that they had State Department players in the 4th round of the game. And the State Department players said that it left a lasting impact on them such that they explored similar political military games at the State Department thereon after. So it's that kind of interagency process, I think, is really important, especially to kind of build trust and communication. But games of diplomacy and negotiation, I think, are ultimately something that the emotion and empathy can really benefit from.
All right. I want to open it up to the room for any comments or questions for our extraordinary panelists. Ellie?
Reflecting, one of the common themes in all of your comments was sort of the importance of the institutional context in which the game is run. It's something, as someone who straddles, when I'm writing sort of analytically, I spend lots of time talking about how we should document that. And then when I'm a practitioner, I find myself utterly unable to document it appropriately. It's just the realities of sort of the politics of the organization mean that it's really hard to get that into the reporting. And so as I'm thinking about sort of ways for Jackie's archive to be building, I'm wondering what there are opportunities from all of your practice to be able to think about not just what the breadcrumbs designers could believe that might not have sort of the same potential pitfalls as some of the current approaches, also sort of other types of information we can be bringing in that help with that contextualization. Whether, John, sort of what the process of digging through the RAND archive and having it by person so you had some of that context, when could that sort of approach be helpful? Stacy, having the public facing and having the working with the press and sort of what that role was. And sort of from the more commercial sector side, what are there opportunities to, are there hooks that AI can use to help us understand what that context is, that sort of thing? I'm just curious where there's some opportunities there.
This is the thing that is tough across sort of all policy making. And I mean, because it's all done within this context of institutions. The wargame community is not alone in this. This is exactly the things that are going on. And, it's the things that are sort of remain unsaid in policy making. And, as you're conducting a set of meetings and putting things together for decision makers, things are always being sort of narrowed down to the kinds of interests that we're trying to zero in on. My plug would be for those who are researching these things, this is the fundamental, reason why we still need historians around to be able to place those contexts, to sort of be able to build all those things around and to do the deep investigation into like kind of what this all meant. I would hope that in our archiving methods that we are doing our best to sort of communicate and conceptualize those things. I think we're going to be figuring out how we make sure that where we can ethically to be able to sort of include the individuals who participated and who helped plan, and to be able to see over time sort of what this what did their experiences connect to, what were they doing at the time, to be able to gain an understanding would be critical. But I also understand all the pitfalls that come with that as well.
I don't know, Allie. I'm honest. You're much more ambitious than I am. I think getting people to just basically document what they've done, it would be a huge step up from where we are right now for the most part. So, understanding and contextualizing it within institutional history seems really hard and potentially fraught with risk from the part of the person writing the report, depending upon your relationship with the institution that you ran it for.
But that would be the thing, that if we had an active curation, if we were looking to point at things that should have already kind of reached the public and been released, but as we all know, there's a huge backlog, right? If we were incentivizing documents, not just game reports to come out, but also the game design data, the back and forth between the sponsor and the organizer, so that in the future archive, people aren't just analyzing what I would call process data, which is the game report. They also have data about game design to help them inform them. That is harder to get. It's on our wished for list.
Little histories of those who, the folks that are in this room that have been designing for years and years, right? How do you think about doing oral histories?
That's true. Oral histories would be really helpful. Yeah. Some of the insights that I've gained about the role of wargaming in defense policy have come from interviews that I've done of Bob Work or Mike Vickers or Andy Krafenovich or, the whole ONA gang. That has been actually almost more insightful than any one report that I could find.
And I think the interesting thing, especially at RAND, was that kind of back channel elements that were kind of really, that I learned more about the game when I actually saw the game. Because I saw months and months and years of different agencies talking to each other, of pitching games, of getting ideas back and forth about how to design it, about debating, do we use a chipboard, do we use pegs, like all these kind of things that you get how things are made a lot more.
Yeah, and maybe there's a request from us who are now living in the unclassified world that those who are doing classified games preserve documentation. I know it feels like it's not important, but preserving not only game reports, especially in this digital age where you can just delete stuff, also preserving all information about how games are derived. Not for me necessarily, right? But for the researcher 30, 40, 50 years down the road who's trying to understand why we made the decisions that we did today.
Hillary Wakestraw, Joint Staff J8. Sort of a comment, because you're talking about historians and gaming. Our division ran 3 games for the Joint Staff Surgeon on COVID, first in February 2020, August of 2020, and early December 2020. The latter 2 were more about vaccine distribution sorts of thing. But the Joint Staff has a historian, and the historian is writing a report on this is how the Joint Staff responded to COVID. So they came down and they talked to us in our division about what were these games, where did they come from, what did you do? So there are places where it's happening. I'm not sure if that report is classified or unclassified, but there is some slight hope for the historical record.
Well, there are people in this room who work for the DoD as historians, and I will say that the service that they provide for future researchers is really extraordinary, because things that you think today are run-of-the-mill, I find myself lately in a lot of 1980s stuff on cruise missiles, and I'm very, very grateful that the contemporary historians preserve that information. Well, I see no point in belaboring. It's already 5:10. I want to say a huge thank you. And for us, this is the beginning of a conversation. And so I'm down for all the spears you want to throw. I appreciate spears that come with solutions. but this is something that we would love to be able to both build something that helps people in this room, but also to use the resources of people in this room to build something that I do think will be helpful in the long run. And I want to thank my extraordinary panelists for taking time out of what are extraordinarily busy lives to come and have this conversation with us. So thank you.
Thank you, Jack.